Imagine today is the day it happens. Every human on Earth vanishes, not dies, not leaves, simply ceases to exist. One moment there are 8 billion of us, the next moment there are zero. No explanation, no warning, just absence. And the world keeps spinning. The sun rises on empty cities, empty highways, empty farms, empty houses with lights still on, food still on tables, machines still running. For the first time in 12,000 years, Earth experiences silence. But that silence only lasts moments. Because the world does not stop when humanity leaves, everything else continues, and everything else has been waiting for this moment without even knowing it. The question is not what happens, something always happens. The question is what happens when the force that has shaped every ecosystem on the planet for millennia suddenly vanishes. What emerges from the space we leave behind? And the answer involves cities swallowed by forests, animals reclaiming territories they lost centuries ago, and a landscape transformed so completely that if you returned after those 1,000 years, you might not recognize the world at all. But the real transformation, the truly surprising one, is not what happens to Earth. It is what happens to the rest of life when given a full 1,000 years to respond. In the first days after humans vanish, the world experiences something like shock. Everything we built is still here, every structure, every machine, every artificial system that took centuries to create still exists just suddenly without anyone maintaining it. The lights stay on until the power grids fail. Within hours, entire cities go dark. The pumps stop pumping. The systems we built specifically to keep water and electricity flowing require constant human attention. They do not get that attention. What happens next is slower but inexorable. Nature does not invade abandoned cities. This is a common misconception. Nature does not have to invade because nature was never not there. It simply stops being suppressed. The plants that have been waiting in every crack and crevice held back by our constant removal begin to grow, not quickly, but persistently. Vines that would take years to cover a wall in a maintained environment now have no one stopping them. Every seed that lands in a concrete crack has a chance to take root. Animals move differently in the first year. For thousands of years, they have learned to avoid human spaces. That learned avoidance does not vanish overnight, but the animals notice something fundamental has changed. The threats are gone. The wolves that lived in fear of humans in their former territories begin to move back into those territories cautiously. The big cats that learned to hide begin to be visible again. The birds begin to nest in places they have never nested in recorded history because those places were always occupied by humans. But the strangest part of year one is the sound. For the first time in human history, entire continents experience sustained periods of near silence. No cars, no planes, no construction, no human voices, just the sounds of wind and water and animals that have no context for how quiet the world used to be. Some animals respond immediately. Songbirds in places that have been too loud for recorded history begin to sing differently. Their pitch changes, their volume changes, they are communicating in a landscape that suddenly has acoustic space for their voices. By the end of year one, the process has begun, but the transformation is still invisible to anyone standing in most places. What you would see is mostly still human infrastructure, mostly intact, slowly beginning to fail at the edges. In the second decade, the transformation becomes visible. The first buildings to fail are the most modern, glass and steel structures that required constant climate control and structural maintenance begin to deteriorate rapidly. Water seeps through cracks, metal rusts, glass cracks and shatters in temperature shifts. Older stone buildings last longer. Medieval cathedrals built without understanding of modern engineering last centuries more. The simple structures that humans built to last, the ones that required no electricity or water pumps, begin to seem eternal compared to the fragile infrastructure of modernity. But even stone crumbles given enough time and water and freeze-thaw cycles. By year 10, entire neighborhoods in every major city have begun to collapse or become overgrown to the point of invisibility. The pattern is visible if you are looking, but the transformation is still incomplete. This is the phase where you could still recognize a city if you flew over it from above. You would see ruins, but ruins of something familiar. But underneath this visible transformation, a much more significant one is happening. Ecosystems that have been fragmented for millennia by human settlement begin to reconnect. The forests that were broken into isolated patches by human clearing begin to merge at their edges. Animals can walk between forest patches that have been separated for centuries. Genetic exchange happens between populations that were isolated. The species that were extirpated, driven into extinction in local areas by human hunting or habitat destruction, begin to return from the refuges where they survived. Predators move into niches that have been empty for centuries. Large herbivores begin to rebuild populations that were reduced to tiny numbers by human hunting. Wetlands that were drained for agriculture begin to refill. Their water table, held artificially low by human pumping, rises naturally again. The plants adapted to wetlands return from whatever survived in marginal areas. Grasslands that were plowed under for crops begin to revegetate, not immediately, but the seeds have been waiting in the soil, dormant, waiting for the season when the plowing stops, and after a decade of no plowing, those seeds are not waiting anymore. But the most dramatic transformation is in the oceans. For the first time in centuries, commercial fishing stops. The industrial fleets that caught millions of tons of fish annually simply stop. The nets are not cast, the engines do not run. Within the first decade, fish populations in the most heavily fished areas begin to recover visibly. Not to pre-industrial levels, that takes much longer, but to levels that were unimaginable to humans who lived through the last centuries of industrial fishing. The species that were hunted to near extinction begin to appear in numbers not seen in living memory. By century 1, the transformation is nearly complete on the surface. Major cities have either collapsed entirely into ruins or become overgrown to the point of invisibility. Stone lasts longer than anything else. A concrete highway will crumble and fracture under plant root pressure and freezing water within a century, but granite and limestone can last much longer. The pattern is striking. Civilizations leave ruins. The ruins are made of the most durable things they built. Stone buildings, granite foundations, occasionally iron structures that have rusted into sculptures, but the vast majority of the infrastructure vanishes completely. New forests grow where cities were, not the forests that were there before necessarily, but forests adapted to whatever climate exists now. New rivers reshape the landscape as soil erosion patterns change. New wetlands form as water table patterns shift back to pre-industrial norms. But the most dramatic transformation is in the animal kingdom. Populations that were reduced to threatened or endangered status begin to recover explosively. In the absence of human hunting and habitat destruction, populations can expand to whatever ecosystem will support them. Large predators move into areas where they have been absent for centuries. A wolf pack moving through the ruins of a city in what was once Europe is no longer an extraordinary event. It is simply what wolves do when given space and prey and time. The megafauna that was hunted to extinction when humans arrived in the Americas 12,000 years ago does not come back. But other megafauna that survived in reduced populations begins to expand. Bison herds that were reduced to a few hundred by human hunting begin to build toward the millions they once were. In Africa, the animals that were always there begin to move beyond the protected reserves that were created to preserve them. The lion prides, elephant herds, and antelope migrations that seemed endangered begin to spread across the continent again, reclaiming territory. But something else is happening that is far more subtle and far more significant. Speciation is beginning. Evolution does not wait for geological timescales. It works on population size and selection pressure. Species that have been isolated in small populations because of human habitat fragmentation begin to diverge. Subspecies begin to become distinct species. New evolutionary paths open. The classic example is what happens to horses. Horses were extinct in North America for 10,000 years until humans brought them back. Now, given a century of freedom, they begin to diversify. Different populations in different ecological niches begin to show distinct characteristics. Within a few centuries, they may diverge into multiple distinct species adapted to different environments. This is happening to hundreds of species simultaneously. By the end of the first century, the Earth is not returning to what it was before humans. It is evolving into something new. By half a millennium without humans, the transformation is becoming genuinely alien to anyone from our time. The landscape is unrecognizable, not because it is desolate, because it is teeming, because it is complex in ways we have not seen in recorded history. Megafauna has recovered to pre-extinction levels in most ecosystems. The extinction event that happened 11,000 years ago when humans arrived in the Americas is being reversed. Herds of camels, horses, and other species that evolved in North America but were hunted to extinction are thriving again. In Africa, the landscape supports more large animals than it has in thousands of years. The biodiversity that seems remarkable to us because we have only ever seen it in diminished form is reaching toward its pre-human levels. But the ecosystems are not the same as they were before humans. They cannot be. The species composition has changed. The climate has changed. The relationships between predators and prey have been rearranged by centuries of freedom from human control. What is emerging is a novel ecosystem, not a restoration, and creation, life adapting to a world that has not existed in recorded history. The plants are transforming too. Agricultural plants that were selected by humans for thousands of years begin to go feral or disappear. The crops that covered vast areas begin to be replaced by native and naturalized species. A wheat field becomes a grassland, a rice paddy becomes a wetland. But some of the plants humans brought to new continents have become genuinely invasive and are changing whole ecosystems. The new world is not a pure return to the old. It is a hybrid, a mix of what was there before, what humans brought that survived, what humans cultivated that went wild, and what emerged in the gaps. In the oceans, the recovery is even more dramatic. The fishing that reduced populations to near extinction has stopped. The ships that scraped the ocean floor clean have rusted to pieces. The oil rigs that extracted millions of barrels a day no longer pump. Marine life responds with explosive recovery. Fish populations rebuild to levels that would have seemed miraculous to anyone alive during industrial fishing. Whale populations that were hunted to near extinction begin to restore. The ocean, which seemed to be being systematically emptied, begins to refill. But there is a profound shift. The animals that dominated human fishing, the species we hunted most intensely, are not the ones that recover first. The species that were left alone, the species that were not commercially valuable, explode. The ecosystem reorganizes around predators and prey relationships that have nothing to do with human commercial value. By 500 years, the ocean supports more biomass than it has in recorded history. The ecosystem is so different from what we know that a marine biologist from our time would struggle to recognize it. By the final century before the 1,000-year mark, the transformation is complete. Entire species have evolved distinctly different characteristics. The wolves that descended from the few remaining wild wolves have evolved larger body sizes due to abundant prey and no hunting pressure. The horses that re-evolved are distinct species from the ones that were introduced. New species have emerged entirely, not new in the way that speciation is a million-year process, but new in the way that isolated populations under different selection pressures begin to diverge so significantly that they have become reproductively distinct within 500 years. The climate itself has shifted. Without human civilization pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the warming trend has stabilized. The carbon dioxide levels have begun to decrease as plants and ocean organisms absorb the excess. A new equilibrium is being found. The landscape is transformed. Where cities were, forests grow. Where forests were cleared, new forests grow different from the old. Where agriculture was practiced, grasslands and wetlands have re-established. The topography itself has changed as erosion patterns shifted back to pre-industrial patterns and glaciers that were melting have stabilized. But the most profound transformation is not visible. It is in the genetic code of every species that has survived and adapted. The bottleneck that was created by humans, where countless species were reduced to tiny populations, is being widened. Genetic diversity is being restored. Species that seemed doomed to inbreeding depression are rebuilding genetically robust populations. The species that were on the edge of extinction are thriving. The species that were locally extinct are returning. The ecosystem is not just recovering, it is exploding with possibility. But there is something bittersweet about this transformation. The species that co-evolved with humans are struggling. The plants that only existed because humans cultivated them go extinct. The domestic animals that had no wild population to retreat to vanish. The entire web of relationships that humans created through 10,000 years of agriculture and civilization simply ends. Dogs, cats, horses, cattle, chickens, wheat, rice, corn. The species that became dependent on human civilization have no place in a world without humans. Some escape, feral populations establish, but most of humanity's creations disappear entirely within 500 years. It is a kind of extinction, not of wild species, but of the species that existed only because humans existed. At 1,000 years, Earth is a genuinely different planet. Not catastrophically different, not unrecognizable, but genuinely, fundamentally different in ways that ripple through every ecosystem. The animals that descend from the refugees of the human epoch have adapted completely to a world without humans. The learned behaviors that helped their ancestors survive human hunting are becoming evolutionary adaptations that manifest even in animals that have never encountered a human. The plants have reorganized into entirely new communities. Not quite the pre-human communities because the climate is different and some species are missing, but genuinely new configurations optimized for the world that exists. The oceans have more life than they have had in millions of years. The marine megafauna that was hunted to near extinction has recovered. The balance between predators and prey has re-established without human interference. But here is the profound truth. In 1,000 years, Earth has healed, not from human presence. Healing is not the right word, it has evolved beyond human presence. Ecosystems have reorganized around the absence of the dominant species. Life has adapted to fill the vacuum, and in doing so, life has become more diverse, more complex, and more resilient than it was in the human epoch. The world does not miss humans. It does not pine for us or remember us. Evolution has no memory, it only has adaptation. 1,000 years after we vanish, every trace of our existence is being rewritten into something else. Our stone ruins become habitat for new species, our metals become geological features, our books and computers and cities decompose into elements that feed new life. And the only evidence that humanity ever existed is in the specific constellation of species that survived us, and the gaps where the species that depended on us should have been. If we returned 1,000 years from now, we would see a thriving, complex, beautiful world. And we would struggle to recognize it as ours.